Let's review basic earnings per share and then sort of get into what diluted earnings per share means. Well, let's first do a definition. You already know what basic EPS is. Now let's talk about diluted. Why do we have to take into account or create a number called diluted earnings per share? Well, the problem with basic earnings per share is it does not take into account the potential for additional common shares to be outstanding. Well, what does that mean? Well, there are securities that are not common stock but might become common stock through their exercise or possible conversion. What does that mean? Well, remember, there are convertible bonds, which allow them to be converted from a bond into a common stock. There's convertible preferred stock, which allows a preferred share to become some share of common stock. There are stock options, which we talked about earlier, where you have the option for employees to buy more shares of stock if they so choose. And then you have other things like contingently issuable securities, which we haven't really talked about those, but we've talked in the past about convertible bonds, convertible preferred, and stock options. So when we have these possible shares that really have not been issued yet, we have to take them into account to come up with diluted earnings per share. It basically dilutes or creates a weighted average share based on all possible shares that may have been outstanding at the end of the year had all of these crazy things been exercised. So that's why we call it diluted. It's the potential earnings per share had all those stock options been exercised or had those convertible bonds been converted over to shares of stock. So let's read through this problem. It's got a lot of information, and then we're going to just first do our basic earnings per share because we all know how to do that one. And then we're going to look at how to do our diluted earnings per share. All right, so basic earnings per share, again, is net income minus preferred divided by weighted average shares actually outstanding during the year. Now, keep in mind, outstanding shares can be sort of altered by, one, issuance of new stock. It can be altered by stock dividends, which we talked about earlier in a video. It can be altered by the potential for treasury stock. Remember, when we purchase treasury stock, that actually reduces our shares outstanding. So keep in mind all these different little pieces that we may have done during the year that would impact our outstanding shares as we read this problem. So on December 31st, Bear Clare Inc. had 380 million shares of common stock. So that's where we start. And 4 million shares of preferred stock issued and outstanding. So we know at the beginning we have those 380 million outstanding shares. All right, so let's dissect this just a little bit. On March 1st, Bear Clay purchased 96 million shares of common stock as Treasury. All right, so remember when we buy those Treasury shares, that reduces our outstanding shares. Bear Clay issued a 5% stock dividend. Okay, wait a minute, we need to take that into account as well, because that stock dividend would have been assumed to have taken place at the beginning of the year. Then 4 million Treasury shares were sold on October 1st. So when we issued those back out on October 1st, that would again impact our shares outstanding. Net income for the year was $600 million. Also outstanding at December 31st were 30 million incentive stock options. Now, when we talk about stock options, we don't worry about those in basic earnings per share because they were not exercised. Okay, the options were exercisable for 30 million shares, exercise price of 56 per share. During 2018, the market price was $70. So we'll worry about this whole stock options in a moment when we do diluted earnings. We do not need it for basic earnings per share. So let's start with our numerator. Now, in both cases, our numerator will be the same because the numerator is always net income minus the dividends for our preferred stock. So our net income for this company was 600 million. Now we need to find our preferred dividends. Remember, to get our preferred dividends, we look at our preferred, it's 9% preferred. We multiply that by the par value, which is 100, times the shares outstanding, which is 4 million. And when we multiply that out, we get 36 million in preferred dividends. So we're going to take this net income of 600 minus our 36 million in preferred dividends, and that's going to give us 564. So that's going to be my numerator. Now, whether we're doing basic or whether we're doing diluted, the numerator is calculated the exact same way. All right, now let's do basic earnings, and we're going to look at the denominator. In other words, how are we going to come up with our weighted average shares outstanding for the year? Now this one's going to be a little bit convoluted because of the way this works out. Remember, we had 380 shares to start the year at. That would be times 12 twelfths, or 1, so we can ignore that. They were outstanding for all 12 months. But don't forget, we had that lovely little stock dividend that we have to take into account. Remember, when we have a stock dividend, we treat it as if it were outstanding for the entire year. Then, what else happened? Well, we purchased 96 million shares of Treasury. So Treasury stock reduces our outstanding shares. So we're going to reduce it by 96. But remember, we didn't purchase those on January 1st. We purchased them on March. So how many months were they actually outstanding or not outstanding for the year? So let's see, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. So those shares were not outstanding for 10 out of the 12 months. But don't forget your lovely stock dividend. So we have to multiply that by 1.05. I know that's weird, but we treat that stock dividend as if it were outstanding for the entire year. All right, now keep in mind we've already taken into account stock dividend. So what else happened? Well, on October 1st, then we issued 4 million shares out again. So we need to add back the 4 million Treasury shares. But again, they were not outstanding for the entire year. They were only outstanding for October, November, and December. So 3 out of 12 months. Now, I know that's a lot, but you got to keep that in mind. When we have the stock dividend, you treat it as if it were all year. Now, why didn't we put the times 1.5 here? We've already taken it into account here. Okay, so if you did 1.5 on both of these numbers, you would double count that 1.5 stock dividend. So we've already got it on all 380 shares. So therefore, we want to take that into account. Okay. All right. So when we divide that out, what do we get? Well, let's go through and multiply each of these out just to see what we get. So 380 times our 1.05 gives us 399 minus 96. So we're going to take 96 times our 10 twelfths. That gives us 80, but then we will multiply it by 1.05, and that's going to be 84. Then we're going to take that 4, and we're going to multiply it by 3 twelfths, and that gives us 1. So we're going to take 399 minus 84 plus 1. That gives us 316. That is going to be our basic earnings per share denominator, okay? Now that will also be the starting point when we go to do our diluted shares, because the only thing we need to add to that would be the exercised options, okay? All right, so let's find our basic earnings per share. I know that was a wee bit more difficult than the last one, but now we understand what goes into it. So we're going to take the 564 and we're going to divide it by the 316, and that's going to give us a lovely $1.78 per share. Okay, so that's basic earnings per share. Notice we have to take into account everything that happens to our stock during the period. We increase it with issuances, we decrease it with Treasury, and we increase it with any stock dividends. All right. Now, let's switch gears and let's add the diluted piece. And in this problem, the diluted piece would include the stock options. Now we're going to start with that 316 because all of the same items, and remember this is only for the denominator, the numerator is always calculated the same regardless if it is a basic or diluted earnings per share. So we're going to take that 316 as our starting point and we're going to do our stock options. Now, our sort of initial instinct is to just subtract 30. But when we have stock options, what we do have to consider is what we call the Treasury stock method. In our Treasury stock method, we assume the money raised from the stock option is used to purchase Treasury shares. So if that's the case, that means not all 30 of those would remain outstanding for that period of time. Only a portion of them would be. Okay, so since these options were exercisable all year, or this year, yep, this year, 2017, or all year because it's 2018 now. So they were could be exercised all year this year. We would take into account all 30, but we would assume that all the money we raised from those shares would go to purchase Treasury stock. So how would we find that? Well, there was 30 million shares and the price per share was $56. So when we take 30 times 56, we got 1680, 1,680,000. Or actually, more than that billion. But anyway, so 1680. Then we're going to divide that because we assume we use it to purchase shares. And what are we going to divide it by? Well, we're going to divide it by the average price of our share for the year. So our average share price was $70. So when you take that out, you get 24 million. So under the Treasury stock method, when we're dealing with stock options, we consider a Treasury stock method. We have to remove the shares that we would have purchased as Treasury stock. So how do you do that? Well, first find out the amount of cash you received from selling out the options. Okay, we had 30 million shares and they were allowed to purchase them at $56 each, and that would give us $1,680 in cash in total, in millions, of course. Now, of that, we would use all of that money to rebuy shares. So we have to take that into account. So we're going to take that 1680 and we're going to divide it by the average price per share, 70. That means we could have repurchased 24 million shares. So when we do the stock options, we're not just going to take the full 30, we're going to subtract out the 24. Okay? I don't know why I have minus there. It should be plus, sorry. Because when we exercise it, our issued shares would go up for that year. Since they were exercisable all year, we would consider this to be a 12 out of 12 situation. All right, so what does that give us? Well, that gives us 316 plus 6. So our denominator here is going to be 322 for our diluted. Okay, so when we get to the diluted, just keep in mind, it takes into account all those things that could have become common stock that didn't during the year. Okay, options, for example, we take in those options and then we assume under the Treasury stock method that all the proceeds we receive from stock options were used to repurchase shares of our own stock. Okay. All right, when we dilute this out, we're going to divide it. That's going to give us $1.75. So a little bit less when we get into our earnings per share for the diluted earnings per share. Now, had we had no stock options or nothing that was convertible, they would be the same number. You don't need diluted. But anytime those stock options or any type of convertible bond or convertible preferred stock exist, then we have to take those types of items into account to get our diluted earnings per share.